Have you checked your social media notifications today? What's your ancestral history like? The clothes that you're wearing, are they handmade or are they manufactured in a factory? These are three seemingly unrelated questions. However, I promise that there is a common theme. Good afternoon, my name is Colin Kupsia, and right now I'm speaking to you in English. Equally, I could be speaking in French or in Romanian, but let's stick to English for ease of comprehension. Language is a form of communication. Different cultures and different groups of people have different languages. This also includes the youth, and today I'm going to be looking at the factors that have influenced the languages of the French and British youth, then, now, and in the future. First, let's cast our minds back to 250 years ago. In the UK, this was a transitionary period between the Renaissance and the Industrial Revolution. Rolling hills in the green countryside were quickly being converted into factories. Idyllic towns such as Leeds, York, and Manchester were converted into slums and shanty towns. The Industrial Revolution brought about trade, and trade brought about trade words. A prominent example of this is pasteurization. Some of these trade words simply remained that, but others started to be transmitted into the language of the youth. For example, the word crinoline first appeared in the English language in the 1830s, but by the 1850s, it was being used by the teenage girls of rich businessmen to describe a stiffened petticoat. The Industrial Revolution also revitalized certain words, such as cotton. This word first appeared in the English language in the 1300s, but by the Industrial Revolution was being used in a noun phrase, cotton-headed, to describe an insulting person. The Industrial Revolution was the first recorded time at least, in the history of the English language where the language of the youth was distinctly different to that of adults. People couldn't understand each other if the youth spoke how they would in everyday society. But what about the French youth? For that, we need to look to a more recent history, in the 1970s. This is when France experienced its mass immigration. People from Francophone countries all over the world were flocking to Paris and started to reside in les banlieues, that is, the suburbs. Now, I don't know why, but I will get into this later. They developed their own special language. Any French teachers or advanced French students in the room will know this as the infamous verlan. Its unique selling point, if you will, is that it affects the syntax of words. In simpler terms, the syllables are reversed. For example, in French, bizarre, in verlan, zibar. In French, femme, in verlan, meuf. In French, arabe, which is a term used to describe somebody of North African descent, so it's very relevant to the theme of immigration, becomes beurre in verlan. I'm sure that you get the point. Now, nobody knows exactly why, and there haven't been any studies conducted. However, as a second-generation immigrant, I choose to believe that these immigrants wanted to avoid cultural erosion. They wanted to be special. They wanted to have an edge on everybody else. In the 70s, it was mostly adults using it, but by the 90s and the early 2000s, it was mainly the youth. The most prominent part of this speech for all of the adults in the room today is what's about to come next, the language of today's youth. I will get into its importance towards the end of this speech. But first, let's think about social media. I get on average 30 notifications a day from various social media sites. At every notification, at every buzz, I rush to pick up my phone to see who's texted me, who's tagged me in what. Children as young as 6 are on social media. It is endemic, it is insidious, and it is a drug in its own right. However, from a linguistics point of view, it's particularly interesting. Social media leads to new trends, and new trends lead to new words. I'm sure that all of the children in the room today will remember the infamous brain rot trend, which started towards the beginning of this year and is currently still ongoing. Letters from the Greek alphabet, such as alpha, beta, and sigma, started to become used by by children and by people who are largely on social media. Noun phrases that derived from video game characters, such as the Skibidi Toilets, started to become used prominently. Much to the dismay of bewildered and disgruntled teachers who struggle to understand what their students are saying, social media's growth is exponential. New trends and new words will be created on a daily basis. Where social media gets more interesting in terms of linguistics is how it's transmitted. Whenever I'm talking to someone, I want to get that conversation done as quickly as possible. I want to move on to what I was doing or something that I'd actually rather be doing. This leads to some very interesting tendencies. And this is the written language of the youth, it's important to remember. In English, we tend to abbreviate. For example, I don't mind, IDM. If you know, you know, IYKYK. I can't lie, ICL, and so on and so forth. But in French, they tend to contract. For example, bisou turns into bis. Aujourd'hui turns into auj. Petit déjeuner turns into pet déj. Remember, this is the written language of the youth. Where it gets even more interesting is the transmission of these written tendencies into the spoken tendencies. Mostly that in English this doesn't happen, whereas in French it does. You'll notice that the abbreviations I said in English contained letters next to each other that you wouldn't normally find in words. For example, D and M next to each other, or Y and K next to each other. But in French, these shortenings are very easy to do. For example, j'ai donné un bis à mon chat aujourd'hui en prenant mon petit-déj. It was very easy for me to incorporate that and would be even easier for a native speaker of the language. Why does English tend to abbreviate and French contract? Again, most people aren't sure, but I think that this is due to the families that they're from. English is a very Germanic language. We like our long words, and I'm sure German students in the room will know that our words are long. However, in French is a Romance language, and as the native speaker of another Romance language, I will tell you that we don't like long words. We like to make them shorter. So it's very interesting to see these tendencies being continued throughout time. But what about the future? What will the youth be speaking like in 100 years from now? I've got 3 key predictions. The first, about social media. As I've said, it's exponential and it will only continue to grow. My second is about the subjunctive. The subjunctive mood is not used in English anymore. However, in French, it is one of the most annoying grammar points that anyone will encounter. It is impractical and hard to use, and I predict that in the next century, the French youth will no longer be using the subjunctive on a regular basis. My third prediction has to do with words which relate to the LGBTQ+ movement. If 30 years ago you were told someone that you were pansexual or aromantic, they would have given you very, very weird looks. And we're not there yet. We've still got a lot of work to do in terms of equality, inclusion, and diversity. But we start to see the rise of words such as allies being used. And I think that as we become more tolerant, these words will only become more common. Just before I finish my speech, I'd like to talk about the relevance of this topic. For the adults in the room, it's important to understand what your child is saying or what the people around you are saying. For example, I am an aspiring medic, and in 10, 15 years, I will no longer be a member of the youth. If I have to see a patient who is a child and they feel nervous, I will be able to tell that by their language, so it's very important. As this speech and the theme of our afternoon is youth, I'd like to end my speech by addressing the youth. And this is something that only the youth will unfortunately be able to understand. I'd like to thank Beyoncé a lot for my speech today, IYKYK, and to everyone in the room, thank you for listening.